Hi there, welcome to Active Intelligence. I hope you'll spend the next half an hour or so with me as we take a look at some cultural issues from a variety of points of view. The goal is balance rather than bias, and that you don't have to be afraid that if your point of view isn't considered PC, that you need to be ashamed of that or keep that to yourself. We're going to explore all kinds of ideas, including the ones that are not popular in our culture at the moment. Speaking of culture, we're talking about cultural appropriation today on Active Intelligence. On today's episode, I caught up with Brad Haami. He's a lecturer and an author and an expert on cultural appropriation from the Māori perspective, although not a Māori issue, but one that is common to many indigenous groups, ethnic groups around the world are experiencing this phenomena, dubbed cultural appropriation. Let's start off in Christchurch, where the Shakti Mat people got in trouble, this time with the Hindu community, for borrowing some Hindu phrases to promote their Shakti Mats. That one was dubbed religious appropriation. There was an exhibition at the Christchurch Art Gallery where an image of a European woman dressed as a Māori woman was deemed to be cultural appropriation. Great offence is taken when things are borrowed without permission. But of course, offence is not always intended. Let's go to the US, to the Family Feud game show where Steve Harvey met the Newhart family who had been to New Zealand, had lived here, had learnt to play rugby and learnt to do the haka.
I actually lived and played rugby in New Zealand. And actually in New Zealand, they have this tradition where they bring on a little challenge to dance. And I think we could break it out for you right now.
I've seen it on rugby before. The New Zealand Blacks.
Yeah, the New Zealand All Blacks.
Yeah, All Blacks, yeah. I rooted for them just, because of their name. But the name is All Blacks, and so that became my favorite rugby team. That's the only rugby team I know. That's crazy.
And we have
they do the little.
Yeah, we have a Newhart haka for you. We'll do it.
Do that for you.
You have a, what's it called?
The haka.
Okay, who does it?
We all do.
Okay, go ahead.
Let's do this. Karite! Karite! Kamahui! Come on, take, kora, kora, come on, take, kora, kora, watikitera,
Big hand for the All Blacks.
Steve, come on, try that. Give me one of those.
I think we can all agree that the Newhart family did not mean to offend in any way, shape or form. That was not the goal of them doing the haka. In fact, it was obviously something they were quite proud of, that they'd learnt to do, that probably was a bit of a party piece as a family, one might imagine. And Steve Harvey's attempt at the end, of course, was probably more out of humour and an attempt to play along. Clearly, he didn't know much about the haka. But offence was not the goal, but offence is not the problem. The problem is taking things that don't belong to you and devaluing them by just deciding that you can use whatever you like and borrow that from another culture. You see, there's a big difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. As Rosanna Deerchild explains, as she was looking forward to Halloween and the fact that many would be dressing up as Native Americans.
I'm talking about those horrifying costumes. You've seen them. Princess Pocahontas, reservation royalty, the brave Cherokee warrior with the plastic tomahawk and all its ilk. Yes, you too can be indigeni for the low, low price of just $29.99, oppression not included. Now, as indigenous peoples, we come from beautiful cultural backgrounds many non-indigenous people admire. I mean, I get it. The beauty in our culture and traditions fascinates you. There's just one problem. We are not costumes. Let me explain the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. What exactly is cultural appropriation? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. Cultural appropriation is when someone takes elements from a culture not their own and remakes and reduces it into a meaningless pop cultural item. I'm thinking hipster headdresses, tribal face paint, and yes, those so-called Halloween harmless fun costumes. It's not harmless fun. That headdress, for example, traditionally a headdress is gifted to leaders who have earned the right to wear one. Receiving a headdress involves ceremonies and protocols and is considered to be a sacred item, and it takes many years for these leaders to earn one. And that Pocahontas and sexy buck outfit, well, they play off dangerous stereotypes of Indigenous people as mythical and historical creatures that once, but no more, roam this great land.
Like the Seminole, Navajo, Kickapoo, like the Cherokee, I'm an Indian too.
Cultural appropriation can be harmful because it is an extension of centuries of racism, genocide, and oppression. Cultural appropriation treats marginalized cultures as free for the taking. So not cool. On the other hand, cultural appreciation truly honors our nation's arts and cultures. When you appreciate, you take the time to learn and interact, to gain understanding of a culture or cultures different from your own. It is a cultural exchange based in mutual respect. The key is consent and participation. If it is about us, then it must include us. A few ways you can truly appreciate Indigenous peoples and culture. Know our history. I don't mean just yours or mine, I mean our collective history. So we truly understand where we come from and where we come together. Remember, appreciation good, appropriation bad.
So cultural appropriation is a different issue from cultural appreciation, and I'm not sure that many of us have picked up on the nuance, on the difference from that, but you can certainly see, particularly if we think back a generation, how easy it was to distill a people group down to just a few kind of stereotypical images and items, and of course in this day and age that won't fly, and for good reason, because people are way more complicated than that. It's not fair to reduce anyone down to a stereotype, but more than that, that things that are precious, that have meaning in other cultures, to simply take them and use them as we please without any consideration, well, certainly this is no longer something that's acceptable, and we can probably see for some good reason, which is why I thought it was important to catch up with a local expert about this issue. I spoke with Brad Haami, who is a lecturer and an author, about what he thought about Air New Zealand trying to trademark the phrase kia ora.
Oh, I think that people use cultural imagery or words or ideas for like a marketing tool or part of the sale of their businesses or and things like that. And I think a lot of the times cultural people in the cultures kind of see this as cultural misappropriation, because they a lot of us, for example, we get upset when people use Māori words or Māori ideas or images to market their products, but it's in an inappropriate way, or what we would deem to be sacred or personal is now being used for something we would say that is not sacred, if you get what I mean.
So in that instance, the not sacred thing is the making money, or is the not sacred thing, in a sense, the wrong group, a group that has no personal ownership over that idea, that word, that symbol, using it?
I think it's both things. The commerciality of cultural ideas and cultural, terms or imagery without informed consent from the people is considered wrong. But also when you've got people from outside of that culture who don't really understand the fullness of those the cultural aspects, that is also what we would consider to be incorrect, unless the people have sought out, the people wanting to use a cultural aspect have actually done their due diligence to enter into conversation with cultural parties that actually have the mana to be able to give them that right, if you get what I mean. It's a big issue. It's something that not me personally, but we as a people, we can you tend to recognize it quickly, like postcards, I suppose. People would take Māori photographs all around the place in sacred spaces or in areas, and then they'll make a postcard out of it and send it out around the world, and they'll sell it. And we see that as cultural appropriation, where someone is using an intellectual property right, I suppose, an intellectual, and using it for their own personal gain, which we would say, well, actually, did you get permission? And that image is being used for your commercial profit, and do you give a percentage of it back to the original owners of that image, or in some way? So you have all of these. The big topic of intellectual property rights actually becomes part of cultural misappropriation.
That's an interesting linking there of IP with culture, sort of this cultural IP. I'm wondering, in that kind of logic, is there ever a time where something that starts off as cultural becomes so sort of universally known and accepted that it kind of loses its IP because now it's kind of shared? I'm thinking in particular of the story of Air New Zealand attempting to trademark the phrase kia ora. Now, on the one hand, we can see it's a ridiculous request because it's a common usage phrase at the very least, let alone being a Māori phrase. And of course, you can't really trademark a phrase like that and can't own that phrase. But I suppose from Air New Zealand's point of view, they were now seeing the phrase kia ora as transcendent, that it was now shared, it was owned by all Kiwis. Is that not true? Can something become everybody's in the end?
Well, I think, terms like kia ora and, Māori terms are becoming part of normal everyday conversation. And they are transcendent in the sense that everyone has, a right to participate in the use of those terms. But when you look at Air New Zealand as I would see it as a commercial venture, that the name becomes a marketing tool for their profitability, then it gets into a cloudy kind of area.
Well, let's imagine, though, for a second, though, that it wasn't a profit-related issue. And, of course, with Air New Zealand, we could almost make the case in that it's primarily now a public-owned, government-owned, therefore owned by Kiwis, enterprise. But even if it wasn't profitable, if we took profit out, can this idea that things now are so used universally that cultural IP idea, in a sense, doesn't quite make as much sense of it?
Yeah, I suppose there is what I would suggest they do is, they probably did, is go into the Māori world and seek some kind of consent to use it for that big imagery, because it would be hard to divorce the use of that term with their business, if you know what I mean. Even though we would say that it isn't being used for financial gain, it would be hard to how do you prove that? But in saying that, there must be some cultural advice that is given to them, and somebody that can actually, on behalf of Māoridom, give consent.
So certainly we can see how money confuses things, but I'm wondering at a cultural level whether you're able to, in a sense, swap seats with me, because, of course, from a Pākehā point of view, we don't really have any parallel stories. I mean, I can't think really of anything in European culture that we would hold on to so dearly that if somebody tried to use it for profit or for any other purpose who wasn't European, that we wouldn't care less, really. So, of course, from our point of view, from a European point of view, it's not easy to understand this high level of ownership and sacredness because we don't have equivalent ideas. I mean, what would you say to those who are struggling to connect?
Well, if you just look at the imagery of Christ, or even the crucifix, which to maybe the Western world of those who are believers in that, and then you have artists who use that name and use the imagery of the crucifix in a derogatory term that actually defiles Christ and defiles the story of Christianity, and therefore defiles the believers. Then that I would say that's a pretty similar point of view, because we would see things as cultural but also as religious, which so this Hindu symbolism is highly sacred in the sense it is religious, but also we kind of, the idea that people are using these symbols and using the terms without a fuller understanding of how deep that imagery or those terms are within a culture is something that I suppose people are trying to hold on to their cultures in a global setting where everything is free for all, and so those things become part of an intellectual property right to safeguard, the authenticity. I suppose it's trying to safeguard the authenticity of a culture, which are being globalized and colonialized to the point of being totally lost. And so you have got this whole idea of trying to hold on to culturalisms that we don't we're not using them to the detriment of the culture. So I would see Christ and the crucifix and that kind of thing as something that parallels a Māori worldview on that.
Yeah, I can certainly appreciate that's a pretty good example, although, of course, it is different because we know that Christianity branches across cultures in terms of those who subscribe, but certainly maybe those who are struggling to connect could at least appreciate the pain of seeing an image misused, even if that isn't an image that we hold to be precious ourselves. I'm sure many could imagine what that might feel like. I think also part of that challenge moving forward is our kind of global community and our global ethos is that it's more important to see people, not their colour, not their race, not their ethnicity. And there is this sense in which including cultural language and symbols in mainstream usage is an attempt, in a sense, to say we're all in this together. Is there a place for that?
Oh, totally. I think that, our own people are out there using our own imagery, our own terms of reference and our own language to, be seen on the world stage. They just don't like it when people outside of the culture are using it for different types of gain that may not seem to be supporting the cultural framework, if you get what I mean. And so I don't think we have we're not scared of the global dispersal of our knowledge. Actually, we want that as long as it's done in an informed way. I remember there were these dolls that came out. I think it was some German company, and they used the term tohunga, tohunga dolls, that would go down, and there was a legal right against that term because they felt that it was bringing detriment to what that term represented in our culture, and that the dolls and the people making the dolls had no idea. They just looked up the term in a dictionary, So, we would be the same if we were going to use something from Rarotonga or something from Russia or Native America or even American. We would still be, think in our head, how do we honour that, or how can we gain permission to use it in a way that we would enhance the mana of those the original people of those images. You see, so it's a mindset that is particularly indigenous, not wanting to have our identity stolen, or colonized again, and the idea that it's up to us to decide how our cultures are portrayed in the world.
You've used that word colonised a couple of times, and I know for a lot of Pākehā people that's an awkward word because it often feels like, you're suggesting that I'm just like the people who first came and who, aggressively took land and mistreated Māori, and I've never mistreated a Māori person in my life. But you've rightly pointed out that it's more of a mindset now than it is a behaviour in terms of acquisition by force. What is the mindset? Can you help kind of crystallize what is that colonial mindset that maybe someone who comes from a Pākehā background just takes for granted is the way the world is, but actually it's kind of a descendant of that colonial way of thinking?
Oh, well, I think I remember we used to, when we were kids, we used to go to the shop and you can get a tea towel. And on the tea towel, it's got a Māori chief. One of the, Lindau's paintings or Goldie's paintings, someone's put this image on a tea towel. And you go, and now people going, hold on, that guy on that tea towel, that image, belongs to that family that live across the road. That's their great-great-grandfather, who was quite a sacred warrior, who and therefore has quite a lot of mana. But someone didn't ask them if they could use that image to put on the tea towel to sell the tea towel, But the tea towel actually is for washing dishes of people's food, or cleaning a dish after people have eaten on it. Well, food. The image of that chief in our mind is the chief, right? Therefore, food is a negative term, or no, food in itself actually destroys tapu and destroys mana. And so here we are using a tea towel with that chief's head on it, to clean plates that low-born people have eaten off, and and food on his face, which is totally destroys the tapu of that ancestor in his genealogy. So because we would never put food or a menial task like that associated with highborn chiefs, because it brings high offence just from a cultural point of view. So cooked food is something that destroys tapu, or the presence of chiefliness or identity in a lineage. So just that, I just remember that alone, we would look at these tea towels and all of these kind of trinkets as tourist things and go, man, they can't do that. But where did that actually come from, Or other things like certain plants in Aotearoa that in actual fact now the copyright ownership of the medicinal aspects of Māori or New Zealand plants are owned by some company in Germany or France. And so in actual fact, we actually have to get permission from a foreign country to use our own plants for medicinal purposes. And who gave anyone the right to sell it in the first place? So, all of those things, that's what the intellectual property rights Waitangi Tribunal claim was all about, was the right of ownership to have a say in the decisions around aspects of our culture that were being sold off as assets to other nations. So a little thing from a tea towel to a kawa plant, it's medicinal purposes being sold to Germany or France or someone.
So could we say then that the colonial mindset is much more, in a sense, an assumption? The assumption being, if I want to use it, I can. And it won't even dawn on me to ask, does this mean anything to anybody else? Would anybody else be hurt by this or have a different view of this? As long as I fancy using it, that's all I need to know. And that essentially the colonial attitude that still lives in modern people is this sense that we don't need to ask anybody. The fact that we want to do it is all we need to know.
Yeah, I would say that is a colonial point of view, but I'd say it's become part of a business mindset. Let's just, but these days, I don't think you can move that way now if you want to be authentic. So we want to use authentic ideas, and so there is a Māori organisation or a mark, a mark that you can put on your product. I think it's under Toi Iho, which is actually validates your product within a Māori framework to be used around the world, and that Māoridom actually in some ways respects that and actually consents to it. So there is a whole process in that as well, that you can go online and check it out. And, if you want to be authentic and more respectful of cultural ways of marketing and display and all of those sorts of things. Like a lot of, I work in the film world, and we're constantly having to look at storylines and characters to make sure that the Māori characters in the films and in the scripts, especially if they're historical, are actually authentic for the time. And so even there, you're having to look at the way that we are portrayed in the public sphere, in the New Zealand and the global arena, to make sure that we're portrayed as a people, portrayed in a way that is authentic. Because years ago people would make films, but we were never included in the creative process and also the editing process and then the marketing process. So people would put our images out there without in ways that were defamatory. We do have a mindset that's watching out for that all the time. There was a recent artist, I think, where she was using tāmoko that belonged to living people, but had used it without actually asking those who wear it, and so that caused a huge ruckus. So the whole idea, that's coming down to the idea of copyright again, cultural copyright, intellectual property rights, which are becoming which is a very valid way of looking at the way we do business.
So Brad Haami has introduced us all to this new idea called cultural IP, intellectual property. And I suspect it's a real thing, isn't it? Certainly, it's a way of valuing, because I suppose in the commercial world, we know what IP is and we know how important it is and how you can't nick somebody else's IP. So it's been a good idea, I think, to adopt that sort of language, cultural IP. Now we understand why it's precious and why we can't use it without permission. And yet it seems that permission is not too hard to get, as long as you take the effort to get to know people, to ask them to talk about what is appropriate use. Certainly what I've learned from today's episode is how my impulses are not to ask. That I just figure somehow that if I want to use something, I can, and I don't need to think twice about it. Now, I don't know if that's some sort of colonial DNA within me. Perhaps it is. I mean, perhaps these things run so deep that we are simply not conscious of them. What is clear is that what was acceptable a generation ago is no longer acceptable. We need to learn to relate to other people from other groups on their terms rather than on ours, so that when we do use things from other cultures, everybody's okay with that, and it is part of the great melting pot where we're getting to enjoy being a global citizen in a global community. But let's make sure that we don't do that just assuming that other people are happy with our choices. Remember what they say about assuming. Well, I'd like to hear your thoughts about this. Ever been accused of cultural appropriation? Felt hard done by? Been mistaken, misunderstood, misjudged? Get in touch. activeintelligence.nz is the website, and you can subscribe there so that every episode of Active Intelligence comes straight into your inbox. We'll see you next time on Active Intelligence.